My name is Will. I'm a TOPdesk consultant, and I'm going to be taking you through the virtual appliance. So just a few housekeeping points before we start. During the webinar, you can use the panel on the right-hand side to ask questions. I have a colleague who's going to be answering questions during the presentation. And at the end of the webinar, we're going to answer any outstanding questions and follow up via email if necessary. So you are free to leave the webinar early if that's what you need to do. So the webinar should last around 40 minutes, but it might finish a little bit earlier. And once we've finished, we're going to upload the webinar to our webinars page, so you can view the recording later on anyway. Final thing to suggest is just that if you're not using the panel to ask any questions, we do suggest you collapse it, as otherwise it's going to obscure the slides. Okay, so the structure of this webinar is pretty simple. We're going to start off with a bit of a recap of the theory behind the appliance. My colleague Kai van Dalen has a very extensive webinar about some of the greater background around the virtual appliance. So if you want to go into more detail, then at the end of this webinar, I do suggest you go and check his one out on our webinars page. Once we've done a recap of the theory, we're then going to explore an example migration to the virtual appliance, and along the way, we'll check out some common troubleshooting issues you might run into. So let's begin by looking at the virtual appliance theory. Like I mentioned before, not going to be a deep dive, more sort of surface level overview. Again, there'll be a link to our webinars page at the end of the webinar if you want to check out my colleague's more in-depth background webinar. So we'll start off by exploring a typical process for installing the classic TOPdesk installation, i.e. the ones that all on-premises customers are using now. So typically when we install one of these from scratch, what we do is we start off with a brand new application server. Now this can be any type of server. It could be virtual or it can be a physical machine. It can be any sort of operating system, although we generally find our customers are using Windows Server. Whatever it is, to this application server, we add in Java. Once we've got Java, we can then install TOPdesk itself, and we can install the licenses that we've been given. Once the application server is then up and running with TOPdesk, the next thing we then need to do is turn to a database server. So on this database server, we add a new database for TOPdesk to use, and then simply point the application server at that new database. From this point onwards, we have a basic functioning TOPdesk installation. To finish off, it's worth considering using a third file server. So optionally, if you want to store things like uploaded documents or any import scripts that you're using on a separate server to the application server, this is also fine. All we need to do is make that share available, and again, point the app server to this new server. So the key thing to bear in mind with the classic installations is that these three different server roles can be played by more or less any combination of machines. So for example, one thing which is possible to do, it's not recommended, but it's possible, is that the application server, the database server, and the file server can all be located on the same physical machine. Of course, the file server can also be on the same machine as the SQL server as well. So let's contrast this a little bit then with a virtual appliance installation and see what some of the key differences are. So the first thing to bear in mind is with the application server. So with the virtual appliance, we give you a pre-configured image of a virtual machine, which functions as the new application server, which is this blue box here. The main difference here is that because we have pre-configured this image for you, the installation already comes with the correct version of Java and the correct version of TOPdesk on it. Again, once this has been configured, we can then turn to our database server, create a new database for TOPdesk to use, and again, point the application server at this new database. Finally, again, we can use a file server to store things things like uploads, attachments, and any import scripts. But crucially, with the virtual appliance, the licenses also live on this file server now, rather than the virtual appliance itself. And the same thing goes for any certificates we're using for HTTPS connections. Another key difference with this is that once we've pointed the virtual appliance at this new file server, with the databases, with the virtual appliance, we can no longer support Oracle databases, and these need to be MS SQL databases now. There's a little bit more background about this reason for dropping support for Oracle you can find in the extranet. Another key difference is that because this virtual appliance is a pre-configured machine running Linux CentOS, it's no longer possible for this machine to either contain the database or any of the files, the uploads that are attached to it. So because of this, there are now instead a minimum of 2 machines required for virtual appliance installations, contrasted with the theoretical minimum of 1 for the classic installations. Of course, there are no restrictions on file servers and SQL servers. These will frequently be played by the same machine. So with this in mind, the differences between the 2 installations, let's just take a little bit of a look at what a typical migration process might look like from a classic installation to the new virtual appliance architecture. So there are a lot of permutations that are possible in terms of which servers are supporting which server roles. But with this example migration, this goes through the most common configuration that we see at our customers. On the left-hand side, we have the application server, which is containing Java, TOPdesk Classic, and all of the license and various files that are being used. And on a separate machine, we have an SQL server, which contains the TOPdesk database. So when we're migrating to the virtual appliance, the first thing we'll need to do is import our virtual appliance to our virtualization infrastructure. And as mentioned before, this will therefore already contain Java and TOPdesk. The next thing we need to do is stop the old TOPdesk instance. So we don't want 2 versions of TOPdesk to try to use the same database. So we simply deactivate the old TOPdesk, and we're then ready to point the virtual appliance at the pre-existing database. Finally, we need to take care of the file server for the virtual appliance. So you can either recycle your old application server into the file server, or you can provision as a new server or use a different pre-existing one. Whatever you choose to do, once we have a file share available, again, we point the virtual appliance at it so we can install our licenses, and then we've finished doing our migration. So with all of this theory in mind, let's look at some practice. What we're going to do is jump through an example migration of a classic installation to a virtual appliance. Before we do that though, I just want to talk a little bit about the setup that we're using. So what we'll be doing is taking, on the laptop this webinar is being hosted on, there is an installation of TOPdesk Classic, also an SQL server which contains the database for this, and a file system with shares where things like uploaded documents are being stored. What we're going to do is we will import a virtual appliance into our local hypervisor, which is going to be VirtualBox. And once we've done this, we can then follow our migration process, stop the classic TOPdesk installation, and then point the virtual appliance at the pre-existing database and also the file share for the licenses. In this example, the TOPdesk versions match. So both the local installation and the new installation are going to be the 2019 Q2 on-premises release. So there won't be any database mismatch issues. But if you do also want to upgrade TOPdesk versions at the same time, it's fine. There will just be an extra step along the way where you need to get the new system to upgrade the database for you. So before we begin as well, just to talk a little bit about what the prerequisites are for when you'd like to attempt this yourself. The first thing you'll need to do is download the virtual appliance itself. So this can be found on the extranet in the indicated location underneath downloads. And when you navigate through to the latest version, you can see on the right-hand side, you'll have the option to download the virtual appliance files. Now on this page, several files are going to be available. So please check the names of the files to make sure you download the correct one for the hypervisor you're using. So for instance, there's a different file format for Hyper-V versus VMware, things like this. What we'll also want to gather are some other bits of information. So we'll need all of the details to do with our database that we're using, as well as a Windows file share to store our licenses, and details of an account which can access this. And of course, we'll need our TOPdesk licenses. So let's take a look at what an example migration might actually look like. I'm going to exit the presentation and jump into my web browser. So I have the local installation of TOPdesk open in a browser. So I've changed the color for this to be red so that it's a little bit more easy to identify. I'll just log in to the operators section very quickly. So in the operators section, we have, again, a red color scheme and some notes and some dummy data. The main thing I want to show is I have saved a bookmarked call. So this call here, for instance, is from Mr. Dean in the demo database. What we'll do just to kind of test that everything is working is I'm going to attach a test document to this call, which has been attached here. When I open this, I can see that all it says is this is a test file. So what we'll do is we'll use this as a litmus test when we finish the migration to make sure that everything is working. Something else I do want to draw your attention to is some of the database settings. So if I go to the settings page, underneath technical settings, you can see there's various settings such as the locations of the search index, which are all pointing to folders within the TOPdesk installation itself. So we have search index folder, a files folder, and an import folder. So we'll take a look at the installation itself in a second, but for now, I'm going to log out of the operators section and log in to the administrator web console. So this should be familiar for when you're inputting database settings. We'll just quickly review how these have been set up for this local environment, and then we'll get started with the migration. So here we can see, yeah, this local installation is using Microsoft SQL. Like we mentioned in the URL, we can see that it's a local database server which is being used. We have a database name here and an SQL login, which is authenticating to that for us. So I'm going to log out of this one now and quickly jump into the file system. So this entire TOPdesk installation has been installed in this folder here, TOPdesk Classic. So in this folder, we can see all of the regular files that come as part of a TOPdesk installation. The one I want to draw your attention to is this files folder. So we can see that that attachment that I just uploaded has now clearly been uploaded here, as well as our import folder that we mentioned and our folder for search indexes. Okay, so also in this file system, I have a separate folder called Virtual Appliance. Before we start the migration, I just want to show you this share folder. This is the folder we're going to use as our virtual appliance share for things like licenses and whatnot. So we can see that this has been shared on the network under the name share. And I'm going to just leave it as my Active Directory account, which we're going to use to access this. But of course, when you're doing this in a production environment, it's sensible to use a service account. There's currently nothing in this share, but we'll see in a little bit that the virtual appliance is going to create some folders for us. Okay, so we're now ready to begin the migration process. So this is my local hypervisor virtual box. Some of the steps we'll go through here will have parallels in your own hypervisors, which will look slightly different, but be the same in principle. The first thing we're going to do here is import the virtual appliance image from the folder I've downloaded from the extranet already. So I'm just going to browse to where I've saved that folder. I choose the correct version, so I'm using VirtualBox, so I'm careful to use the VirtualBox file. And in VirtualBox anyway, the only change I'm going to make is I'm going to give this a different name just for easy reference. So while this imports, just to mention, downloading these folders from the extranet, yeah, please be careful checking that you have the correct version, because you can get some mismatching issues if you download the wrong one. There's also some extra information on the page itself about what is contained in those downloads, as well as how to maybe import those into your hypervisors. So okay, I've imported this machine now. Before we launch it, I'm going to just change some VirtualBox specific settings to make sure the network features are working correctly, and then we're ready to start it up. So while this starts, I just want to talk a bit about what it's going to look like. So as we mentioned, this virtual appliance is using a different version of a different operating system, which is called Linux. It's a version called CentOS. This particular version does not come with a graphical user interface. So when it's fully loaded, we're going to have to interact with this only via commands, and also a mixture of some interactive windows too. So for instance, now that this is booted up, we can see that this is the screen we're greeted with. So the first thing that we need to do is log in with the default user which has been provided to us. So the name of this user is support. So I simply type the user support, hit return, and then it prompts for a password. So the first password that is given is TOPdesk, which I've just typed in. Now, when you type in passwords to this area, the prompts on the screen don't change. This is a security feature of Linux. Don't worry, the password is being recorded. So the first thing we do when we boot this up for the first time, once we've logged in, we need to set the keyboard layout. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to change this to UK English so that any special characters in my passwords don't get disrupted by the different keyboard mapping. So okay, I've chosen English. Now I just need to change the password of that support user to something which isn't the default. So something to highlight at this stage, please be careful and read the prompt carefully. So for instance, you'll see there are some restrictions placed on the password to make sure that it's a strong password. And the other thing, which is easy to miss, is that the first thing you need to type in is the current password, not the new password. So I've set a new password, set it again, everything has been updated successfully. So in future now, when I need to log back in to the virtual appliance, I will use the support username still, but the password that I've just changed is what I will use to log in. So please keep this password safe, as you'll need it if you ever need to reboot the virtual appliance. Okay, so now that the password has been changed, we're in the TOPdesk configuration wizard. So this is a step-by-step wizard that we can use to make some basic changes to the machine. We'll go from top to bottom. So the first step is the networking step. Let's have a look at the networking step. So the network step, if you're using DHCP in your virtualization infrastructure, so your IP addresses are being assigned for you, then you won't need to use this first step that we're going to look at within here. If you assign your IP addresses statically, then you will need to go into this edit a connection page. So there is one virtual Ethernet cable connected to this, which I can edit. Again, all of this navigation is just arrow keys, enter and space. So if you want to statically assign an IP address to this, all you need to do is navigate down to the IPv4 configuration, change this to manual, and hit show. This will let you add the 4 things that are required. So the first thing is the address that you wish to add. So for instance, if you want this to have the static IP 1234, type that in here. You will also need to provide the subnet mask using the CIDR notation. So for instance, if your subnet mask is 255.255.255.0, then you can assign that via this 24 notation. Once you've set the IP address itself, you can also set the default gateway. You then can add as many DNS servers as are relevant. So I would of course suggest that you add as many domain controllers as possible if you're on a Windows-based network, just for redundancy. And finally, you can also add in the search domains. So if you don't add in your domain name, like this, if you don't add in your domain or domain names, then you'll have to put all of the host names in your various configuration areas as fully qualified names. So if you want to just be able to use naked machine names, then make sure you remember to add those here. Now, I mentioned that DHCP users don't need to worry about this step. That is indeed what I am using, so I'm not going to save any of those changes. Which means that all I do need to do now is set the system host name. So the host name is TOPdesk by default. Obviously, you can follow whatever naming conventions you use in your organization. I'm going to set mine to be webinar, which has been updated for us now. Okay, so now that the network section is done, let's take a look at the next step, which is the time zone settings. So the time zone settings are reasonably straightforward. The first thing we can do is we can look at the primary NTP servers that the machine gets its clock synchronized to. So by default, these are the servers of the Linux distribution. What you may want to do is change these to be your domain controllers again, so that your clock is kept in sync with the rest of the local network. I'm going to leave mine as is for now. Next thing we can do is set the server time zone. So by setting this, we can browse to Europe. I'm based in England, so I'll scroll down to London. And then when we hit save, daylight savings and these sorts of things will be kept up to date on the machine from this point onwards. Okay, so let's look at the next step. So the next step is to look at the shared folder that we talked about before. So this requires a few pieces of information. The first is the username that we want to use to connect to our shared folder. Next, we have the password, of course. And finally, we have the data folder path to connect to. So these are essentially going to be a UNC path, except we are using / instead of \. Something else that you might have also noticed is I'm using an IP address here, but of course you can use your own. You can use the host name of a machine instead as well. This is fine. While that's saving, I also want to point out the username format. So the username, we recommend you specify in the username @ domain format. Please be aware that the domain \username format does not work, but a naked username can also work as well. So we see that the shared folder has mounted successfully. What that means is if I now navigate back to the file system and enter that share, we can see that the appliance has created 3 folders for us already. So the most important one of these is the license folder. What I'm going to do is take the licenses that I've got prepared, paste them into this license folder, and then when we come to enter the database settings, that means that we'll be able to activate those licenses straight away. What we can also do is I'm going to create some new folders as well to put some extra pieces of infrastructure on the share. So I'm going to put the search indexes on the share. as well as the import folder of the machine for import scripts and data sources. So I've created these by hand as well. Finally, a note on this folder mounting step. A common issue will be that the folder can't be mounted. There could be a few reasons behind this, but a key one I want to highlight is the SMB version. So we have to use, well, by default, excuse me, the virtual appliance uses SMB 3, which was introduced in Windows Server 2012 onwards. So if you're using a server on Windows 2012 or newer, then you shouldn't have this SMB version issue. If you're using an older server, such as Windows 2008, then this will only support SMB version 2. Now, it is possible to change the version of SMB the appliance uses, but this is not something which we recommend. So wherever possible, we suggest you just use a newer machine. If you do need to do this though, there is a knowledge item available in the extranet that you can refer to. Okay, so we've mounted our folder, we've added our licenses. Next, let's look at the admin console. So this is necessary because traditionally, the admin web console, where we put in the database info, can only be accessed via the server that the TOPdesk is installed on. However, because there is no web browser on this machine, we can't just fire up a web browser and go to that console. We have to allow other machines access instead. So we can add one or more IP addresses here. So all of the traffic is going to be coming from my laptop, which is at this particular IP address. You can turn this into ranges though with the aforementioned CIDR notation. And for your test environments, although this is not recommended for production, you can use this special allow all address as well. But for now, I'm just going to leave it as this, where only this laptop is allowed to connect. So once I've saved that, there's only one more step that we need to look at, which is the HTTPS configuration. So under this step here, we can enable or disable using secure web connections. So as a prerequisite for this, we will need to have some certificate files. I have a certificate and a private key file in this PEM format, which I'm just going to copy to that share again. So this is the SSL folder that was created for us. In the private subfolder, I need to put the key file, and in the public subfolder, I need to put the certificate file. Now, I've pre-generated these certificates. They're just local testing certificates, but I've pre-generated these before the webinar. They need to be in this PEM format, which is essentially a text-based format, which looks a little bit like this, base64 encoded text with a begin and an end block at the start and finish. Now, if you have certificates in a different format, that's fine. It's possible to convert them to this PEM format, which is required. There are guides on the extranet of how to do this. But now that we've copied these to the SSL folder, so we've got the key file in the private folder and the certificate file in public, we can now simply go back to our configuration wizard, hit the space bar to enable TLS. We can optionally toggle the version, but I'm not going to do that today. And then once we save those changes, we get all of our connections with HTTPS. What we'll see in a minute is when I first connect to the virtual appliance, we'll see probably a certificate warning because these are just testing certificates, but obviously that's fine because it means that it's read the relevant key and is presenting them to the browser. Okay, so the final step is the integrated database authentication. So this is for if you would like to use a passwordless authentication to an SQL server. I'm not going to use this step today because I'm just going to use simple SQL authentication with a password. But again, on the extranet, there is extra detail about how you can set up this integrated authentication. which I'll direct you to at the end of the webinar. So for now, we've finished the initial configuration wizard. I can navigate to this Start TOPdesk at the bottom, enter that, and then TOPdesk will boot up for the first time. While that is booting up, I'm going to navigate to my web browser. So what I've done already is I've pre-configured a DNS entry to use this alias of webinar.topdeskuk.com. To point at my virtual machine. Of course, you will have to do this manually in your own DNS system, but it's something which you can do at this stage once we first start TOPdesk. And once that's finished restarting, I'll be able to use this address to navigate to TOPdesk. So this page is something you might see while working with the appliance. It's not an issue. All it means is that the appliance just hasn't yet finished restarting. What we're about to do as well is once it's finished restarting, we're going to enter the admin console and then point the TOPdesk at the existing database so that we're ready to switch over from the old to the new environment. Okay, so now the page is loading. So we expect to have an error because it doesn't know which database to connect to yet. This is fine. We're just going to now log into the admin web console. It's allowed me to this login screen, so we can see that we were successful in adding my laptop to the allowed machines to log in. The password, the username and the password, you can find these in the installation instructions in the extranet. For now, let's log in and then fill out all of our database information. Okay, so we're going to enter the IP address again of the database server, i.e. my laptop. Again, you can use a host name here if you would prefer. And then we're going to fill in the information of what the database is called and such. So the database is called Virtual Appliance Webinar. I'll just enter the SQL login information. So we're using webinar login and then enter the password. Save that information and I can test this just to make sure that I haven't made any spelling mistakes. So the database is ready to use. So we've successfully connected to the local database server with the same database the old environment was using. Like I mentioned before, if you're using a newer version of TOPdesk here, you may need to upgrade the database at this stage, and you also may need to activate your licenses again. But all of this is the same as with a traditional environment. So now we're ready to finish the migration. What I'm going to do is stop the original TOPdesk to stop any database clashes happening there. So if you've got your TOPdesk running as a service, you'll simply need to hit stop. If you're not running your original TOPdesk as a service, you'll find it in the system tray where you'll be able to stop it. And now that I've finished doing that, I can make a restart of TOPdesk by entering this TOPdesk restart command. And now TOPdesk will restart for the first time in a functioning way. So I use this TOPdesk restart command on the virtual appliance itself. Now this is one of a few commands that we've provided for you, which are outside of the out-of-the-box Linux commands, which will allow you to do various things with TOPdesk. The easiest way to use these is to use the TOPdesk help command. So if you type in TOPdesk-help, hit enter, it will show you a complete list of all of the commands that we've provided for you. So the most useful one of these is the top one, TOPdesk-config. This one returns you to the config wizard that we used before. So if you ever want to adjust the file server settings, for example, then you can do that here. Also at the bottom, you have TOPdesk stop, start, and restart, which are the best ways of managing the TOPdesk service itself, as well as the TOPdesk status command, which will tell you some information about how TOPdesk is currently running. There are a few, any other Linux command, of course, will also work. So if you have Linux experience, then you're welcome to run any of those, but these should do everything that you'll need. And they're mainly to do with the config wizard and stopping and starting the service. So I've lost connection because we made a restart, which is fine. I'll re-navigate back to the home screen and wait for it to finish restarting properly, at which stage we are nearly done with the migration. Something else which is also worth pointing out about the running commands is that there is another useful command that you might want to consider, especially if you're statically configuring IP addresses, which is ifconfig. ifconfig is useful for checking your internet connection. So if you're unable to mount your file share, for example, this is a common reason why. So underneath this Ethernet device, not the loopback device, I can see that I have an IP address established and subnet mask and various other things. These two pieces of information tell me that my network connection is working successfully. If you've forgotten, for example, to statically configure your IP address and there's no details here, it means that your network connection is down and you'll need to return to the network step. Okay, so it seems like we've finished restarting now. So we can now see that we're back into this exact same database with this red color scheme. I'll log back in to the environment and even though we can log into this now, we haven't quite finished with the migration. There's just one final thing that we need to take care of. So I've logged back in and we can see that this is the exact same database based off the call that we created earlier. So the only things that we need to finish now are some of those technical settings that we originally looked at. So I'm going to go to the settings and change all of these settings to point to our new virtual appliance specific ones. So we'll start off with search indexes. So instead of using a search index folder on the server itself, what we can do is I'll use, just for example's sake, the search index folder of the file share that we created. Now, to refer TOPdesk to the file share, you need to use this special path, which again is available on the extranet. This alone says use the file share that was mounted, i.e. that Windows folder. And from this point onwards, you can then just add in folder names and subfolder names with slashes and names. Also bear in mind the use of forward slashes here rather than Windows style backslashes. So now, instead of using its own folder, it's going to use this shared folder for its search indexes. I'll do the same thing with the upload path. So again, we use this special path, mnt TOPdesk data folder, and I'll use my uploads folder that was created for me. And finally, the import folder. Again, this is for any import scripts that we want to use. Again, we'll change the folder path to this special data share and then use the import folder that we created before. Okay, so now that these settings have been updated, I'll restart TOPdesk one last time so that it takes account of those. And then what we should see is within this share that we created, this folder, and this folder will start being used for any future updates. We can test especially the uploads folder by taking from the original installation from our files. This was our uploads folder in the original installation. If we copy the entirety of this, obviously a production environment's upload folder will be a lot bigger than this, so it will take longer to copy. But we can take that folder, paste it into our new upload folder that the appliance is going to be looking at, and then we should be able to then download that test file we uploaded earlier. What we could also do, if we had some import scripts and stuff that we needed to copy over as well, we could do exactly the same thing. From within the traditional installation or wherever it's saved, find our import folder, copy all of the contents to the new virtual appliance, share, imports folder. So again, I've lost connection because we made a restart of the service. Again, we need to wait just a little bit longer for it to restart, but once this is back up and running, this will then be a fully functioning virtual appliance installation. Something to point out about this as well is that within this data share, I forgot to mention this, I've only been using top level folders because that's what the appliance creates for you by default for the license, SSL, and uploads. But don't forget, you can use other subfolders if you want to kind of change the structure of this. You don't have to follow the example which is laid out here. This is especially true of the search indexes. It's also okay to leave these just on the server itself. But there again, there's more info about that on the extranet. So we finished the final restart. So I'll log back in for the last time. And as our final litmus test for a complete migration, let's return to that incident that we've bookmarked and download the file that we uploaded to that call. So here's our call from Mr. John Dean again. Here's the test file. When I click onto that, you can see that that has now successfully downloaded, and we can see that the contents of that have survived intact. So with that, we are finished. We've completely migrated a classic environment from the classic system to the virtual appliance. So to finish us off, I have a few extra resources that you can use in your quest to upgrade your virtual appliances. The first one is this. So KI 10568 in the TOPdesk extranet. This is the virtual appliance master knowledge article. So this contains links to many other articles, all of which are to do with some particular aspect of the virtual appliance. And these can cover topics across the entire spectrum. So it's things like general data, update frequencies, as well as more technical hands-on topics. This will also contain a link to KI 10325. So this one contains the specific instructions for how to make a new installation. So a lot of the steps that we went through today have come from this particular article here, 325. I mentioned earlier that there has been a previous webinar about some of the theory behind the virtual appliance. You can find this webinar once it's finished being recorded, and all of our future webinars at the following link. And don't forget, we also have our lovely support team who are always available to field any questions about the virtual appliance that you may come across. You can contact those by phone or via the extranet. Of course, before you start making your migrations, you're always welcome to contact your account managers or consultants if you have any other queries about the process. We always recommend, as a final note, to upgrade your test environment first before making any changes to your live environment. Okay, so thank you all for attending. What we're now going to do, we're going to stick around for a little bit, answer any questions that may still be ongoing from the chat, and then we'll end the broadcast. So again, thank you all for coming. Have a great rest of the day.